While making my morning coffee, I heard a shrill scream. This is a major HOA violation. A strange woman was standing right on my porch, waving a clipboard, like she was the sheriff. She told me to tear down my cabin on my ancestral land. This cabin was reducing the value of her neighborhood by 12%, and she wasn't going to let me trash her area. I looked at the small dog barking madly at her feet, and the fake HOA badge skewed on her cheap sweater. And guess what? Just a week later, she paid the price. Have you ever encountered a HOA Karen like this comment below where you're viewing? I need moral support to tell the rest of this crazy story. The morning had started so peacefully in my little Pine Valley sanctuary. I'd inherited this beautiful 2.00-acre plot from my grandfather, along with the cozy log cabin he'd built back in the 1970s. The place was my escape from the tech world. Just me, my coffee, and the sound of wind through the pine trees. I had no idea that this Tuesday morning would change everything. The woman on my porch looked like she dressed from a discount rack, faded sweater, wrinkled khakis, worn heels that clicked aggressively on my wooden deck. But what really grabbed my attention was her behavior. She was jabbing her finger at my cabin like it had personally insulted her family, while her tiny chihuahua practically vibrated with manufactured outrage. Sir, I'm Darlene Pratt, president of Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, she announced, thrusting her clipboard toward my face like a weapon. This structure violates multiple building codes and community standards. You have 72 hours to begin demolition, or will be taking immediate legal action. The absurdity hit me like a slap. This woman was on my property, on land that had been in my family for generations, issuing ultimatums about what I could do with my own cabin. I tried to keep my voice calm as I explained that this was private property completely outside any HOA jurisdiction, but Darlene wasn't interested in facts. She started waving her arms dramatically, insisting that her community standards gave her authority over the entire area. That's when she crossed a line from annoying to criminal. Darlene pulled out her phone and started live streaming, pointing the camera at my cabin while declaring it a dangerous eyesore that's destroying property values throughout the valley. Her little dog was still going absolutely insane, and she kept trying to shush it while maintaining her dramatic performance for her handful of online viewers. But the live stream wasn't enough for her. She wanted to make a lasting statement while still filming herself. Darlene marched over to my gate and pulled out a can of red spray paint from her oversized bag. She proceeded to paint a giant X on my gate while announcing to her audience that this marked illegal construction scheduled for immediate removal. Watching this complete stranger vandalize my property while broadcasting it to the internet, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just neighborhood drama. This was a coordinated attack on my life and property by someone who'd clearly lost touch with reality. The red paint dripping down my wooden gate looked like a declaration of war. But instead of exploding with anger, I found myself fighting an internal battle. Part of me wanted to call the sheriff immediately and have her arrested for trespassing and vandalism. Another part of me was curious to see just how far she'd push this insanity before reality came crashing down on her. The calculated ways she was documenting her own crimes told me this woman had no idea what kind of legal trouble she was creating for herself. "Ma'am, you're currently trespassing on private property and vandalizing my gate," I said, in my most professional voice. Pulling out my phone to record her actions, I'm documenting this for my insurance company and the local authorities. For just a moment, Darlene's live stream persona faltered, As she realized she might have gone too far, but then her bravado kicked back in stronger than ever. "This is community enforcement action," she declared, puffing up her chest like some kind of appointed official. "You'll be hearing from our legal team, the county building department, and law enforcement." Very soon, she gathered up her dog clipboard and spray paint, but before leaving, she pulled out her phone again and made a call right in front of me. "Yes, I need to report illegal construction and harassment," she said loudly into her phone, making sure I could hear every word. "There's a man here who's built an unpermitted structure and is threatening community members who try to enforce building codes." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was calling the police and filing a false report while still standing on my property after vandalizing my gate. The sheer audacity was breathtaking, but it was also about to become her biggest mistake as she gave my address to whoever was on the other end of that call. Darlene turned back to me with a look of pure malice. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, mister. By the time I'm done with you, you'll wish you'd never built this piece of trash on our mountain." As I watched her march off my property, her heels clicking on the gravel driveway, and her dog still yapping indignantly, I looked at the red paint dripping down my gate and realized Darlene Pratt had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She'd not only committed multiple crimes while recording herself, but she'd also called law enforcement to a scene where she was clearly the perpetrator. Within 30 minutes, I could see police cars winding up the mountain road, and I knew this morning was about to get very interesting for Ms. Darlene Pratt. After watching Darlene's dramatic exit and bizarre police call, I decided to do some investigating of my own while waiting for the authorities to arrive. My first stop was my elderly neighbor Ellie, who lived about a mile down the mountain road in a charming cottage that used to be surrounded by the most beautiful flower garden in the valley. When I knocked on her door, I found her sitting at her kitchen table with red, puffy eyes and tissues scattered around like evidence of recent tears. The story she told me made my blood boil and confirmed that Darlene Pratt was exactly the kind of person I suspected she was. After this morning's performance, Ellie led me through her house to the back door, where she pointed to a large patch of bare dirt that stretched across what should have been her backyard. "That's where my garden used to be," she said, quietly, her voice trembling with grief. 20 years of roses, lavender, and wild flowers that my late husband planted before he passed. Darlene showed up 3 months ago with an official-looking letter claiming my garden violated community aesthetic standards. The elderly woman's shoulders shook as she described how Darlene had brought along supposed community representatives who demanded the garden's immediate removal. She said, "I had 30 days to replace everything with approved landscaping, or face $50 in daily fines." I'm 78 years old, Luke. I couldn't afford those penalties on my fixed income. But the most disturbing part of Ellie's story was yet to come. She invited me inside and showed me a stack of emails printed on cheap paper, all supposedly from different Pine Ridge Estates residents complaining about her garden's impact on their property values. "Look at these," she said, spreading the papers across her kitchen table. "Mrs. Johnson from Maple Street, Mr. Peterson from Oak Avenue, the Williams from Pine Court, all saying my flowers were an eyesore that needed to go." I studied the emails carefully, noting something that Ellie's trusting nature had missed. The writing style was identical across all of them. Same sentence structure, same vocabulary, same dramatic phrasing about community standards. When I called Jenny Collin to discuss what I had discovered, she immediately picked up on the same pattern. "Luke, send me photos of those emails," she said urgently. "If these are all from the same person using fake accounts, that's fraud and harassment. I can trace the IP addresses and prove they're bogus." Within an hour, Jenny called back with news that made my hands clench into fists. Every single one of those emails came from the same IP address she reported, and that address traces directly to Darlene Pratt's home internet connection. She created fake community outrage to terrorize an elderly woman into destroying her life's work. The evidence was damning and heartbreaking. Darlene had manufactured an entire campaign of neighborhood complaints to justify bullying Ellie into tearing up her beloved garden. She'd even gone so far as to create fake email accounts with names. That sounded like real Pine Ridge residents, complete with fictional addresses and detailed complaints about property values. There's more, Jenny continued. I found records showing Darlene's been collecting fees from properties outside her HOA's actual jurisdiction. She's been running a protection racket disguised as community governance, and Ellie wasn't her only victim that afternoon. My phone rang with an unknown local number. "Is this Luke Harris?" the caller asked nervously. "This is Tom Bradley. I live in Pine Ridge Estates. Words getting around about what happened with Darlene at your place this morning, and I wanted to warn you she's planning something bigger. She called an emergency HOA meeting for tonight to discuss your cabin and what she's calling her enforcement option." Tom explained that he and several other residents were fed up with Darlene's authoritarian behavior, but felt powerless to challenge her because she'd surrounded herself with loyal supporters who voted down any opposition. "Luke, you need to understand, Darlene's not just some overzealous HOA president," Tom continued. "She's been systematically targeting anyone who doesn't fall in line with her vision of community perfection. The Johnsons got fined for having the wrong color mailbox. The Garkas were threatened with legal action for parking their work truck in their own driveway, and poor Ellie," his voice trailed off with obvious sympathy, "this woman's been terrorizing our neighborhood for months, collecting illegal fees and making up rules. As she goes along, most of us are too scared or too tired to fight back." As I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the pine trees gold, I found myself quietly smiling despite the morning's chaos. Darlene thought she was dealing with some random guy who'd built a cabin without permission. Someone she could intimidate and bulldoze, like she'd done to Ellie and countless other residents. She had no idea that I owned not just the cabin, but every single acre her precious Pine Ridge Estates was built on. My grandfather had been quietly accumulating land throughout the valley for decades, and when he passed, everything had gone into a family trust with me as the sole beneficiary. The irony was almost too perfect to be real. Darlene had spent months terrorizing residents and claiming authority she'd never actually possessed, all while living on land that belonged to the very person she was now trying to destroy. But I wasn't ready to play that card. Yet I wanted to see just how far she'd push this war before I revealed the truth that would end her reign of terror forever. When those police cars came winding up the mountain road at dawn the next morning, I knew the real battle was just beginning. The sight of 3 patrol cars blocking my driveway at 6 a.m. was clearly designed to intimidate. But all it did was confirm that Darlene had escalated this conflict to a level she wasn't prepared for. I could see her, standing behind the vehicles with her clipboard and that insufferable little dog directing the operation like some kind of general who'd forgotten she was just a fake HOA president with delusions of authority. Sheriff Ron Bell stepped out of the lead car, and I could tell from his weary expression that he'd dealt with Darlene's manufactured emergencies before. "Morning, Mr. Harris," he said, with a respectful nod that immediately told me he wasn't buying into whatever story Darlene had fed his department. we received multiple reports about unpermitted construction and harassment of community members. Mind if we take a look? Around behind, the sheriff stood 3 people. I didn't recognize, all wearing matching Pineridge Estates polo shirts and uncomfortable expressions that screamed, "I don't want to be here." These were obviously Darlene's so-called witnesses, though. They looked more like hostages than concerned neighbors. The woman in the middle kept glancing at Darlene for direction, like an actor who'd forgotten her lines, while the 2 men flanking her had the body language of people who'd been coerced into participating in something they knew was wrong. These residents have documented serious violations that are threatening our community's safety and property values, Darlene announced dramatically, gesturing at her fake witnesses like she was presenting evidence at a murder trial. Her little chihuahua punctuated her speech with a series of shrill barks as if it too was outraged by my cabin's existence. Sheriff Bell looked tired as he accepted a stack of papers from Darlene, clearly wishing he was anywhere else on this beautiful morning. "Ma'am, I'll need to verify these claims through proper channels," he said diplomatically. "Mr. Harris, do you have building permits for this structure?" This was the moment I'd been preparing for. Since yesterday's chaos, I disappeared into my cabin and returned with a folder containing all the original building permits, county approvals, and inspection certificates. From when my grandfather had constructed the place back in the 70s, every document was properly filed, stamped, and certified by the appropriate county departments. The sheriff's expression shifted from professional skepticism to visible relief as he reviewed the paperwork. "Everything appears to be in perfect order here," he announced loud enough for Darlene and her fake witnesses to hear clearly. This structure was legally built with proper permits and passed all required inspections. There's no violation of any building codes or county regulations. I watched Darlene's face cycle through confusion, denial, and finally a desperate kind of rage as her carefully constructed harassment campaign crumbled in real time. "That's impossible," she shrieked, her voice cracking with panic. "Those permits must be fake. This building wasn't here when our development was planned. He's bribing officials or forging documents." Her fake witnesses started shuffling uncomfortably, probably realizing they'd been dragged into a situation that was about to explode in spectacular fashion. The sheriff turned to address Darlene directly, and I could hear the warning in his voice. "Ma'am, these documents are legitimate county permits with official seals and signatures. Making false reports to law enforcement is a misdemeanor offense, and I'd strongly advise against continuing down this path." But Darlene wasn't finished destroying herself as the sheriff prepared to leave and her witnesses began slinking back to their cars. She made one final desperate play that sealed her fate. "This isn't over," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me while her dog went absolutely ballistic. "I don't care what those fake papers say. This is harassment of our entire community, and I won't stand for it. You'll be hearing from our lawyers, the county commissioners, the state environmental board, and anyone else I can find." The raw desperation in her voice was almost pitiful as she realized her authority was completely imaginary and her harassment campaign had just been exposed in front of law enforcement. As she gathered up her dog and her clipboard, Darlene turned back with pure venom in her eyes. "I'm going to make your life hell until you tear down this monstrosity and get off our mountain." Her threat echoed across the valley as she stomped back to her car, leaving deep heel marks in my gravel driveway like some kind of petty revenge sheriff. Bell shook his head wearily as we watched her dramatic exit. "Mr. Harris, I apologize for this disruption. Your permits are completely legitimate. And if she continues harassing you, don't hesitate to call us." But as the patrol cars disappeared down the mountain road, I found myself feeling almost sorry for Darlene's fake witnesses. They'd been manipulated into participating in their neighbor's personal vendetta, and now they had to live with the consequences of her desperate behavior. The internal battle I felt watching those people slink away told me everything I needed to know about Darlene's methods. She didn't just terrorize individuals. Like Ellie and me, she manipulated entire groups of residents into supporting her authoritarian crusades through fear lies and social pressure. These weren't evil people, they were victims of a woman who turned community leadership into personal dictatorship. As I stood there looking at the fresh heel marks in my driveway, I realized that stopping Darlene wasn't just about protecting myself anymore, it was about freeing an entire community from her reign of manufactured terror. After that morning circus with the sheriff and building inspector, I sat alone on my porch, staring at the red paint still staining my gate, and something fundamental shifted inside me. For months, I'd been content to live quietly in my inherited sanctuary, letting the world spin around me while I focused on my work and my peace. But Darlene Pratt had shattered that peace, terrorized my elderly neighbors, and now she was escalating her campaign with fake witnesses and manufactured evidence. The time for passive defense was over. It was time to go on the offensive. I walked inside and pulled out the old leather-bound atlas my grandfather had kept in his study, spreading it across the kitchen table to study the hand-drawn property lines that marked our families and true holdings throughout the valley. Running my fingers over those faded ink boundaries, I felt the weight of responsibility that came with owning land that dozens of families now called home. My grandfather hadn't accumulated this property to become a feudal lord. He'd preserved it as a legacy for future generations, while allowing others to build modest lives within its borders. But Darlene had forced my hand by weaponizing that very community against innocent people like Ellie. Looking at that map, I made a decision that would change everything. It was time to remind Pine Ridge Estates exactly who their landlord was and what happened when tenants declared war on the person who owned their ground. My first call was to Jenny Collin, who'd been researching Pine Ridge Estates' legal structure since yesterday's chaos. "Luke, you're not going to believe what I discovered," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Darlene's been running a systematic fraud operation disguised as HOA governance. She's collected over $15,000 in illegal fees from properties outside her jurisdiction, and there's evidence she's been using association funds for personal expenses." The documentation Jenny had uncovered was damning. Landscaping bills for Darlene's own property paid with community money, unauthorized salary increases she'd voted herself, and a pattern of financial irregularities that would make any prosecutor salivate. But Jenny's most disturbing discovery involved Darlene's escalating surveillance of anyone who opposed her authority. "Luke, I found receipts showing she hired a private investigator last week," Jenny reported, according to my source at the PI firm. "She's been having people followed their trash, searched their daily routines, documented. This woman has completely lost touch with reality." That explained the strange feeling I'd had lately of being watched, the sense that someone had been through my garbage, the unfamiliar cars that seemed to appear whenever I left my property. Darlene wasn't just harassing me through official channels, she was conducting illegal surveillance to find ammunition for her personal vendetta. That afternoon brought confirmation of just how unhinged Darlene had become. Tom Bradley called with news that made my blood run cold. "Luke, you need to see what Darlene posted in the community group," he said urgently. "She's sharing photos of your cabin, but they've been digitally altered to make it look like you've been dumping toxic waste and running some kind of illegal business operation." The manipulated images were crude but effective propaganda. My peaceful cabin transformed into what appeared to be an environmental disaster zone, complete with fake chemical drums and fabricated pollution. Darlene was literally creating false evidence to support her harassment campaign. The breaking point came when I found fresh tire tracks in the soft dirt around my property perimeter, along with cigarette butts and fast food wrappers that suggested someone had been conducting extended surveillance from the tree-ine. Whoever Darlene had hired wasn't just following me, they were camping out on my land, documenting my daily routines and probably taking photos through my windows. The violation of privacy was bad enough, but the implied threat made it clear that Darlene viewed this as total warfare with no boundaries or limit. That evening I made the decision that would end this conflict once and for all. I walked back to my grandfather's study and opened the old safe he'd installed behind a false panel in the wall, entering the combination he taught me as a child. Inside were the original land deeds, purchase agreements, and legal documents that proved my family's ownership of the entire Pine Valley region. As I carefully examined each yellowed page with its official seals and signatures, I felt my grandfather's presence guiding me toward the inevitable confrontation that would restore peace to our mountain. I spent the rest of that night preparing my legal ammunition, copying documents, organizing evidence, and planning the revelation that would destroy Darlene's fake authority forever. By dawn, I had everything I needed to prove that every resident of Pine Ridge Estates was living on land that belonged to me, paying rent to a trust fund they'd never heard of, while being terrorized by a woman who possessed no legitimate power. Whatsoever the war Darlene wanted was about to become the biggest mistake of her life, and I was finally ready to give it to her when Tom Bradley called the next morning to warn me about Darlene's planned community meeting. I quietly smiled and began packing the documents that would change everything into a leather briefcase my grandfather had carried to business meetings decades ago. It was time for Pineridge Estates to meet their actual landlord. The morning after receiving Tom's warning about Darlene's community meeting, I found myself drawn back to my grandfather's study with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Something about the weight of impending confrontation made me want to understand exactly what I'd inherited beyond just acres and boundaries. I'd been through these boxes before, but always casually, never with the focused intensity that comes from knowing you're about to change dozens of people's lives forever. Hidden behind a stack of old business ledgers, I discovered something that made my hands tremble, a leather portfolio tied with string that contained my grandfather's personal correspondence about the Pine Valley Development Project. The letters revealed a side of my grandfather I'd never known, a visionary who'd recognized that this beautiful valley would eventually face development pressure from expanding suburbs and commercial interests, rather than sell to the highest bidder or develop the land himself for maximum profit. He'd chosen a different path, carefully planned residential communities that preserved the natural beauty while providing affordable homes for working families. I want this land to nurture families, not enrich developers. He'd written to his attorney in 1973, let them build their homes and raise their children among these pines, but let them know they're stewards of something larger than themselves. Reading those letters, I finally understood why the lease agreements were structured so generously, why residents were charged modest rates that barely covered property taxes, and why my grandfather had insisted on managing the properties through a third-party company that kept his identity secret. He hadn't wanted to be seen as a landlord collecting rent. He'd wanted to be an invisible guardian protecting a community from the commercial forces that might otherwise destroy its character. The responsibility I felt looking at those documents was overwhelming, but it also crystallized my resolve to stop Darlene's reign of terror that was corrupting everything my grandfather had tried to create. When I called Jenny with news of my discoveries, her response was immediate and decisive. Luke, what you're describing isn't just property ownership, it's stewardship of an entire ecosystem. She said, "Your grandfather created something special, and Darlene's been systematically destroying it through fear and intimidation. You don't just have the legal right to stop her. You have a moral obligation to protect what he built." Jenny's voice took on the sharp edge she reserved for courtroom arguments. "And legally speaking, you're not just the landlord of Pineridge Estates, you're the sovereign authority over that entire valley. Darlene's been playing queen of a kingdom that belongs to you." The final piece of the puzzle came when I found my grandfather's original development plans, hand-drawn maps showing how he'd envisioned the community growing over decades. While preserving maximum green space and wildlife corridors, every street in Pineridge Estates had been carefully positioned to minimize environmental impact, every common area designed to provide residents with access to nature, every building restriction crafted to maintain the valley's character. Darlene's authoritarian rule wasn't just illegal, it was a complete betrayal of the community centered vision that had created Pineridge Estates in the first place. Armed with this understanding, I spent the afternoon organizing my evidence into a presentation that would not only expose Darlene's fraud, but also reveal the true history of Pineridge Estates to residents who'd never known the story behind their community. I wanted them to understand that they weren't just tenants paying rent to some distant corporation. They were participants in a multi-generational experiment in sustainable community living that my grandfather had devoted his life to protecting. The leather briefcase that had once carried my grandfather's business documents would now carry the truth that would free Pineridge Estates from Darlene's manufactured tyranny. That evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the pine trees gold, I felt my grandfather's presence more strongly than ever. Tomorrow night's community meeting would be the culmination of everything he'd worked to build and everything I'd inherited. The responsibility to protect. Darlene thought she was organizing a public tribunal to destroy my reputation, but she was actually providing the perfect venue for me to reveal the truth that would end her fake authority forever. I carefully placed the original land deeds, lease agreements, and my grandfather's letters into the briefcase, knowing that these documents would transform not just my life, but the lives of every family in Pineridge Estates. The war Darlene had declared on me was about to become the moment of liberation that restored my grandfather's vision to the community he'd created. As I locked the briefcase and prepared for the confrontation that would change everything, I could almost hear his voice whispering through the pine trees. Sometimes the only way to preserve something beautiful is to fight for it. The Pineridge Estates Community Center was packed beyond capacity when I arrived that evening, with residents filling every chair and lining the walls, while 3 news cameras captured what Darlene had promised would be my public destruction. The atmosphere was electric with tension as people whispered nervously about the dangerous criminal who'd been threatening their community, unaware that they were about to witness the complete inversion of everything they thought they knew. Darlene stood at the front of the room in her discount store, blazer clipboard in hand, looking like a prosecutor preparing to deliver a death sentence. Her fake witnesses were scattered throughout the audience, ready to provide manufactured testimony, while Marcus Webb and her other board supporters occupied the front row like a jury that had already reached its verdict. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to this emergency community meeting. Darlene began, her voice carrying the false authority she'd been wielding for months. We're here tonight to address a serious threat to our community's safety and property values. Luke Harris has built an illegal structure on our mountain and has been harassing residents who try to enforce our community standards. She gestured dramatically toward me, sitting quietly in the back row, with my grandfather's briefcase on my lap. This man represents everything we've worked to protect Pineridge Estates from lawlessness, environmental destruction, and complete disregard for our community's character for 20 minutes. I sat silent while Darlene built her case against me, presenting her manipulated photos, reading fake complaints from manufactured residents, and painting me as some kind of mountain hermit who declared war on civilized society. Her fake witnesses testified about property damage that never happened, environmental violations that existed only in doctored photographs, and threats. I'd never made the news cameras captured every accusation, every dramatic gesture, every moment of what Darlene clearly believed would be her greatest triumph as Penerage Estate's self-appointed protector. But as I watched the faces in that crowd, I realized something Darlene had missed in her narcissistic tunnel vision. Many of the residents looked uncomfortable with her presentation, shifting in their seats and exchanging skeptical glances as her accusations grew more outlandish. These people knew their neighbors, knew their community, and Darlene's portrayal of me as a dangerous criminal didn't match what they'd observed. Tom Bradley sat near the middle of the room, shaking his head slightly as Darlene's fake witnesses delivered their rehearsed testimony. Even some of her own board members looked embarrassed by the theatrical nature of her performance. When Darlene finally finished her presentation and asked if I had anything to say in my defense, the room fell completely silent. Every camera turned toward me as I stood slowly, my grandfather's briefcase in hand, and walked to the front of the room. The weight of the moment pressed down on me as I realized I was about to change the lives of every person in that crowded space. Actually, Darlene, I do have something to share with everyone, I said calmly. I think you're all going to find it very interesting. I opened the briefcase and pulled out the original land deeds, their aged paper and official seals clearly visible to the cameras. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce myself properly. My name is Luke Harris, and I'm the owner of this community center, the land it's built on, and every single acre of Pineridge Estates. The gasp that went up from the crowd was audible even over the hum of the air conditioning system. People leaned forward in their chairs, craning their necks to see the documents I was spreading across the table at the front of the room. Darlene's face went through a spectacular transformation: confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally a kind of panicked rage as she realized her entire world was collapsing in real time. "That's impossible," she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. She was already beginning to understand that her authority had been completely imaginary. From the very beginning, I placed the lease agreements on the table where everyone could see them, each document bearing official county seals and signatures that proved Pineridge Estates had been built on land leased from my family. Trust, these papers show that my grandfather purchased this entire valley in the 1960s and 70s. I explained to the stunned audience Pineridge Estates was built on land leased from our family, with payments handled through a property management company so residents could feel like homeowners without knowing they were technically tenants. The legal papers were undeniable proof that every resident had been living on my land for years, paying rent through their HOA fees to a trust fund they'd never heard of. The reaction was immediate and devastating. For Darlene's fake authority structure, Marcus Webb went pale and started edging toward the exit, clearly realizing he'd been complicit in harassing his actual landlord for months. The fake witnesses began looking around nervously, probably wondering if they could be charged with fraud for their rehearsed testimony. But the most dramatic reaction came from Darlene herself, who seemed to physically shrink as the implications hit her. She took several unsteady steps backward, bumped into her chair, and nearly collapsed as she grasped the edge of the table for support. "Darlene," I said, addressing her directly, "while the cameras captured every word, you've spent months claiming I was violating community standards and threatening property values. But the reality is that you've been operating an illegal harassment campaign against the person who actually owns this entire community. Every fine you've collected, every rule you've enforced, every threat you've made has been based on authority that legally belongs to me. The irony was so perfect, it felt like divine justice. The woman who'd appointed herself Queen of Pine Ridge Estates had been nothing more than a tenant having a tantrum at her landlord Tom Bradley stood up from his seat in the middle of the room, his voice carrying clearly over the stunned murmurs of the crowd. So all those fines, Darlene collected all those rules she enforced, all those threats she made to people like Ellie, none of it was legal. When I nodded confirmation, Tom turned to address the room. This woman has been terrorizing our community for months, and she had no authority to do any of it. Other residents began standing up, voicing their own complaints about Darlene's authoritarian behavior, their relief at finally understanding the truth palpable in their voices as the meeting dissolved into chaos, with residents confronting Darlene and reporters scrambling to interview everyone involved. I gathered my documents and prepared to make my final statement. One more thing, I announced, raising my voice to get everyone's attention. Darlene, you're banned from my property, effective immediately. That includes this community centre, all common areas, and my cabin. Any further harassment or vandalism will result in criminal charges. With that declaration, I walked out of the community centre, leaving behind a crowd of liberated residents and one completely destroyed, fake authority figure who just learned the hardest lesson of her life. The morning after the community meeting, I woke up to find my phone buzzing with notifications that my confrontation with Darlene had gone viral overnight. The video of her complete meltdown when I revealed the property ownership documents had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms, with comments ranging from Shod and Freud at seeing a Karen get owned to genuine sympathy for the Pine Ridge residents who'd been terrorized by her fake authority. Local news stations were calling for interviews, and I could see reporters setting up outside my gate, clearly hoping to catch me for a follow-up story about the fake HOA queen who'd been exposed harassing her actual landlord. What struck me most wasn't the attention, but the messages from residents across the country sharing their own HOA horror stories and thanking me for standing up to the kind of petty tyranny that had made their lives miserable. Within 48 hours, the district attorney's office had filed formal fraud charges against Darlene based on the evidence Jenny and I had compiled. The charges included theft by deception for collecting illegal fees, harassment for her campaign against multiple residents, and vandalism for the spray paint incident at my gate. But Darlene wasn't ready to accept defeat gracefully. Accordingly to Tom Bradley, she'd been calling residents non-stop, leaving increasingly unhinged voicemails about how I was part of some conspiracy to destroy Pine Ridge Estates, and that she was the only thing standing between the community and total chaos. Her desperation was becoming dangerous, and several residents had already contacted the sheriff about restraining orders. The final chapter of Darlene's reign of terror began 3 nights later when I was awakened by the sound of breaking glass. And my security system's alarm, I grabbed my phone and activated the cameras I'd installed around my property, immediately spotting a familiar figure stumbling around my cabin. In the darkness, there was Darlene, dressed in black clothes with her hair pulled back, attempting to break into my home through a window, while her little chihuahua ran circles around her feet, barking frantically. But in her desperation to exact revenge, she'd forgotten about her own dog. As she tried to climb through the window, she stepped backward directly onto the poor animal, lost her balance, and crashed through my flower bed in a tangle of limbs and yapping What made the scene even more perfect was that Clay Reynolds happened to be driving home from a late construction job and witnessed the entire attempted break-in. Instead of confronting Darlene directly, he parked down the road and called the sheriff's department while recording everything on his phone. "I've got your HOA. Karen caught Red Hand trying to burglarize your place," he texted me. "Sheriff's on the way, and I'm getting every second of this on video." The footage he captured showed Darlene's complete psychological breakdown, a woman so desperate to salvage her imaginary authority that she'd resorted to criminal behavior that would destroy what remained of her reputation. Sheriff Ron Bell arrived within minutes, and this time there was no ambiguity about who was the victim and who was the perpetrator. Darlene was caught in the act, literally halfway through my window. With broken glass around her and my damaged flower bed as evidence of her clumsy criminal attempt, "Ma'am, you're under arrest for attempted breaking and entering, criminal trespass, and vandalism of private property," Sheriff Bell announced, as he approached with handcuffs ready, the look on Darlene's face when she realized there was no talking. Her way out of this situation was almost pitiful. The transformation from arrogant authority figure to desperate criminal was complete. The community's reaction to Darlene's arrest was swift and final within a week. Pineridge Estates residents had not only voted her out of any remaining positions, but had also filed a civil lawsuit demanding repayment of all the illegal fees she'd collected over the years. But what really showed me how much the community had changed was what happened the day Darlene put her house up for sale. I was driving through Pineridge Estates to check on some maintenance issues when I saw something that made me pull over and smile. Someone had hung a banner across the community center entrance that read HOA Zone, and children were drawing sidewalk chalk pictures that depicted stick figures labeled "No More Karen," being chased away by happy families. The house Darlene had ruled from like a fortress sold within 2 weeks, with neighbors reporting that she'd become a complete recluse during her final days in Pineridge Estates, too ashamed to show her face in the community that now knew the truth about her manufactured authority. Tom Bradley called me the day the moving truck pulled away from her driveway. "Look, I've never seen anything like it," he said, genuine wonder in his voice. "People are coming out of their houses, talking to neighbors they haven't spoken to in months, planning block parties and community events. It's like she was a storm cloud that finally moved on and let the sun shine again." 6 months later, I found myself standing in what had become the most beautiful spot in Pineridge Estates, the community garden I'd helped establish on a corner of my land dedicated to residents. Ellie was there as she was most mornings, tending to the roses and lavender that had replaced the bare dirt Darlene had forced her to create. But today was special. Today marked the first anniversary of her husband's passing, and she'd asked me to help her plant a memorial rose bush in his honor. "Lou, I never thought I'd see my garden bloom again," she said, tears of happiness streaming down her weathered cheeks as we worked the rich soil together. Harold would have loved knowing that his flowers brought people together instead of driving them apart, as Ellie told me stories about her late husband, how he'd been a veteran who'd found peace in gardening after the war, how he'd always believed that beauty could triumph over ugliness. If good people refused to give up, I realized that my grandfather and Harold had shared the same vision. They'd both understood that communities thrive when people are free to express their individual character while working together toward common goals. Arlene's authoritarian approach had been the antithesis of everything these men had fought to protect, and her removal had allowed Pineridge Estates to become what it was always meant to be that evening. As I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the pine trees gold, I pulled out a piece of paper and began writing something I'd been thinking about for weeks. It was a letter to my grandfather, a way of letting him know that his vision for Pine Valley had not only survived, but had grown stronger through adversity. Dear Grandpa, I wrote, I finally understand what you meant when you said that land doesn't really belong to anyone. We're just temporary stewards of something that will outlast us all. Darlene tried to turn your community into a place of fear and control, but the people you trusted to live here proved stronger than her petty tyranny. The valley is peaceful again. Families are flourishing, and Ellie's garden is more beautiful than ever. I think you'd be proud of what we protected together. As I finished the letter and folded it carefully, I felt a deep sense of completion that went beyond simple justice. Darlene Pratt had learned the hardest possible lesson about respecting boundaries and understanding. Real authority, but more importantly, an entire community had rediscovered what it meant to live without fear of manufactured drama and petty control. Sometimes the only way to preserve something beautiful is to fight for it, and sometimes